Just reserve the slots. You're right, dude. I took it was so easy. I took like 2 hours. Yeah, I think it's good to learn software. My boss told me probably not. But I was like, am I going to put it I'm Chris. Kind of like Chris.
No worries, fine. Thank you.
That's right.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much for being here with all of us. And today we have the honor to Dr. Elise Miller-Hooks to be with us. And she is the Bill Alina Hazel Endowed Chair in Infrastructure Engineering at George Mason University. Is an advisor to World Bank Group and founding editor-in-chief of S-Wiser's Sustainability Analytics and Modeling Journal. And prior to this, Elise was actually my predecessor as a program director at NSF, and she actually recruited me. And so Elise has her degree in bachelor's from Lafayette, both master and a PhD from UT Austin. I know in the audience we have several people from UT Austin. And so, and she has wide range of experience. Her methodological expertise is in optimization, and her application domains is very wide. I just pick a few. transportation system engineering, and disruption and planning and response, multi-hazard. Her application goes way beyond transportation because I know she has done hospital logistics as well. And so I know that we have a lot of folks from Mark's class, 416. And so thank you very much for coming in. And in fact, she's going to give a quiz. Okay? And so that's going to be. Oh, okay. Okay, she's going to. Okay, Mark is going to use a quiz, right? And based upon her presentation. So better pay attention. Okay? Okay, awesome. So let's welcome Elise.
Thank you. So I may take this mask off in the middle. I don't know. We're trying it here. So I'm thrilled to be here. This is my first time at UW, and really don't know why it took me so long to get here. It is absolutely stunning. You have a gorgeous campus, a gorgeous day. I guess I'm getting a little lucky. So I'm thrilled to be here. So I'm going to talk today about optimization and machine learning techniques that we've used in a variety of contexts that I thought I would try to pull together in a talk about urban transportation under a sharing economy. And so when I was first asked to give this talk, I was told that I would have a very wide audience, from those in urban planning type of course with maybe little background to those who are experts. And I was told to make it address things that are in all kinds of different areas that have to do with urban environments. And I got all kinds of different things. And I said, oh my God, how am I going to do all that? And so I'm tempting this. And so this is the first time I'm giving this talk. And I had a really good time trying to put it together and to think about what is that sharing economy that we're all talking about, and how does the work we've been doing over the last 15 years roughly relate to that? And we've already been doing it, is basically what I'm thinking. And so I'd love to have a conversation at the end about this sharing economy and what do we really think about it. So I started thinking about what is the sharing economy. Actually, let me start my timer. And so I was thinking, we're sharing excess capacity, and this has been around forever. People have been renting out rooms in their houses and carpooling for eons, right? But what's different here? Well, it's facilitated by peer-to-peer exchange. And I thought, well, a newspaper could be a place that you would put an ad for you renting out your house, and that's peer-to-peer exchange at some level. But now we're doing it at scale, really large scale. So that's really the main thing I think that's different. We might think of this as a collaborative economy, which I really like that term. Let's make that the passphrase. That's your password for your quiz. It's collaborative economy, okay? And so I was reading a little bit about this, and I looked at something I really liked in the Harvard Business Review that argued that sharing is a form of social exchange that takes place among people known to each other without any profit. I thought, oh, that's interesting, because everything we talk about with the sharing economy is about profit, huh? Like, tell Uber that there's no profit involved and Uber won't exist, right? There's this profit involved. So that was kind of interesting. And when sharing is market mediated, consumers are paying to access someone else's goods or services for a particular period of time. It is an economic exchange. And that's really interesting too, because then it's not really sharing, it's really an economic exchange. Knowledge is it looks like a newsletter or something that comes out of Penn's Wharton School of Business. And I love the examples they gave. So sharing is the use of technology to reduce costs and enable customers and freelance workers to do business. An example, they say, now we're buying mobility rather than buying a car, but the one example I really love is, I don't need a drill, I need a hole in the wall. So that's a really neat way of flipping the way we think about what we buy and how what we want to have in our lives. So why do we need the sharing economy, or this kind of this approach in transportation? And one of the reasons this has come about is because many applications we're looking at dense, competitive urban environments. And now, Dr. Chen noted that I worked in hospitals, and I took something here from hospitals that I use in my hospital capacity planning work. We talk about hospitals in terms of staff, stuff, and space. So staff is the workers, like the nurses, the doctors, the technicians. Stuff is the equipment, like your MRI machines, your needles, your linens, and things like this. And space usually is the beds or something like that. So I started thinking about the same thing here. We have competition for staff, stuff, and space, and I want to think about sharing in terms of these three things. Staff, here again, like maybe the drivers, it could be the shippers, the stuff, probably cars, things like this, and space. I was thinking I'm going to talk about parking, so space is an issue, and even highways that take up space. So as excess capacity decreases, there's a need for greater efficiencies in their utilization, and that's really what this is about. So in online applications, we can use optimization and machine learning, as one of the examples, to facilitate new transport markets and services, and new mechanisms for running existing services. So I think about microtransit, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And offline, we can inform urban transport planning and policy. So the applications that I have from my team that we've worked on over the years that I thought I'd bring in, what did we do in these areas, how did we use optimization or machine learning in them, what kinds of things were we looking for, come from vehicle sharing in terms of bicycles and cars, ride sharing, we'll talk about paratransit, airport shuttles, microtransit, parking in terms of new markets, and delivery applications. We've done quite a bit with meal delivery with Grubhub I'll be talking about. So I'll start with the vehicle sharing work. This goes back to probably about 2008. And I'm going to say the word we, because I'm going to talk about we from the perspective of me and my graduate students at the time, many of whom have graduated, some who are still working now. And some of my colleagues have worked on this, some people from business, and the businesses I'll mention have worked on this work with us. And so at the end, I'll share with you who all the we is. So one of the things that we did early in the world of bicycle sharing and vehicle sharing was to look at how do we design these systems. So this was at a time when there were some systems in Washington, D.C. They live in Paris, was doing extremely well, but most places were not doing that well. It's before the boom of the bicycle sharing. And in fact, the student who worked with me at the time was, when he was getting out, he described that he was working in this area to somebody in academia. The person said, why would you work on that? And then it went crazy, right? So very interesting time. So at the time, we were thinking of bicycle sharing in terms of an extension or last mile connection to feed train lines. And we were, in Washington, D.C. area, we were really thinking about the metro. So we modeled this problem as a bi-level network design problem with upper level of the leaders who plan out where you locate the stations. They plan the station capacity, how many slots are there, and how many bicycles will fill those slots, and base inventories. And we looked at the time, now everyone's talking about equity, it's a really hot topic now. So even long ago, we had to think about equity. We were working with Washington, D.C. and Arlington, Northern Virginia, and in D.C., they worried about this equity issue very much, and we built into one of our models the idea that you have to have stations in different wards. So D.C. is divided into wards, and some wards are more disadvantaged than others. And so that even if the optimization doesn't think you need it there, you need it there, is what they were saying to us. The lower level were the flows, these are the riders. So applying it to Washington, D.C. here, first we had an exact solution approach. That meant we would take this bi-level program. We showed that you can take the lower level and replace it with its KKT conditions. These are Courier-Tucker conditions. And they were necessary and sufficient, and then we can reduce the problem to a single level optimization problem that we replace the complementarity constraints, and we'll deal with them with binary variables, and we end up with a mixed integer program. So mixed integer programming is getting a little easier to solve now, but back in about 2008, we couldn't solve very large problems at all. And so we ended up developing a hybrid genetic algorithm where we decoupled the upper and lower levels, and we used the fitness of the solutions from the optimization at the lower level. The application here, in this picture, you see little dots. And the bigger dots with the M show that we chose 19 of the 100 metro stations to serve the bicycles with sharing stations. And we had to look at things like even the size of the sidewalks when we thought about the sizing of these things. And then all the little yellow dots that you see all over the place, those are other sharing stations. Another really interesting thing that came up in this area was this duality between spaces and vehicles. It doesn't come up very often. So when you take your bicycle out of the system, you leave a slot. And there's a demand for a slot and there's a demand for the bicycle. So you never want to show up and not have a slot. So if it's overfilled, you can't drop your bicycle off. And you never want to be under, filled, because then you get there and there's no bicycle. So we end up with this problem of that we modeled as a stochastic mixed integer program with joint chance constraints. So that's a little unusual. It was pretty tricky to solve. So we developed two techniques, one a p-efficient point generation approach and one a cone generation approach. I know that some of you are going to know what this is, and some of you will have no idea what I'm talking about, but hopefully there's a little bit of something for everyone in each of these things. This is showing you, though, that these problems are real and important, and we can use optimization and these mathematical techniques to solve them and get real answers to help society. Here at the time, Singapore had just had a car sharing program that I think was Honda was running it, and it failed. And we actually worked with the data of a failed system. So we were kind of hopeless at the time that we were actually working on this, thinking, oh, these things are never going to take off. But they have, of course. And an example finding here is that the fleet management strategies that explicitly accounted for that demand stochasticity offered much more reliable solutions than if we did them using static methods. So what do I mean by static method? Here I mean, let's suppose we don't account for the randomness and we take some kind of mean value. We take some average value. This is typically what you'll do. When you do that, you're going to have much worse solutions. So accounting for the randomness in the problem is really, really important. The next topic I want to talk about is ride sharing. And I'm going to start back with the paratransit work we did with a company quite a long time ago. So here you'll see that there's somebody in a wheelchair in this picture. I know this is pretty small for the back. I didn't really want to harp on that. But paratransit is typically created for people with mobility impairment who need to have services, public transport, as much as anyone else. And so they get these special services. I love this picture because this is so now common to understand this, but it wasn't. And we made this little picture a long time ago that now seems like, oh my God, everyone knows this, right? So here you see this taxi. It's going from pickup location. It goes to a drop-off location, goes to another pickup, goes to another drop-off. In paratransit and other shared ride systems, it may go to a pickup, go to another pickup, then drop one of them off, then drop the other one off. So you have this sharing curve. In the real systems, there wasn't a whole lot of sharing going on, and these became very, very expensive to manage. So we're working with this company called IT Curves, and you see this little picture down here. That's their MRMS system. We built the engine that goes behind it. So they like to say that we built the brains for it. We built the brains with the optimization approach. So what did we do? We said, okay, so paratransit, they have a contract with the locale, with the local region, and they have to meet certain constraints. If they don't meet those constraints, they have to pay. And they may not get a new contract because they're not doing a very good job. So they have time windows for pickup and drop-off. So imagine your grandmother or grandfather needs a ride to the doctor. They don't want to be missing out on their doctor's appointment. There's a maximum ride time. You don't want them traveling all over the town, picking up everybody, and they're stuck on there for hours, right? So that makes sense. No idling when the passenger is on board. That's, you don't want to just be sitting there while the driver goes and has a cigarette and comes back. So these things were not allowed. So we had this kind of realistic situation, and we had to help them create tours. So we ended up developing a heuristic based on a very simple trip reinsertion and trip exchange approach. There's take out some customers, put some customers in, and do a lot of swapping and things like this. It was called PIN. It's from Jaw et al. In 1986. Been around a long time. Worked really well. And so we just played around with that a lot. You'll see that we spent a lot of time with these kinds of graphs where the red part is the idle time. So you have each one of these lines as a vehicle. And we wanted to show that you can reduce the number of vehicles that you have in operation to make this a cost-effective program and squeeze out that idle time. So for their application in the real world, they had two dispatchers working together 6 hours every night. 4:30 in the morning, something like this, the drivers would come in, they'd get their rosters, and they'd go out for the day. So we were able to reduce that same day kind of thing when we tested this with their data. And we could do this in under an hour, but we could get to our first feasible solution, which was actually pretty good, within 7 minutes. And ultimately, not only did we save numbers of vehicles that had to be used and saved vehicle kilometers, and it's better for the environment and so on. We also were able to save the small, sort of mid-sized company about $800,000 annually in savings, and that was a while ago, so that would be in yesterday's money. They liked this so much that they started putting it out to other mid-sized companies, and it was used quite broadly. I don't know what happened to it since. They liked it so much that we had another project, and we started working on dynamic calls. So this is the idea that instead of having to book everything in advance, these things we call will calls came in. So these calls come in, and there's a certain number of them that could dynamically arise. And we applied a version of this algorithm, of the PIN algorithm for this in a rolling horizon framework. I don't want to spend too much time on this one because we ended up actually diverting away from this to work on something else that I'll share with you, because they got a new contract with IAD and DCA, the two big airports in the Washington, D.C. area. And so our team went from going on this to, oops, okay, they got a big contract, we're going with you, and so we started working on that contract, and I'll explain that in a second. So one of the big things that they were struggling with when they put this code out there and were testing it in places like Arizona, I don't remember, I think California, part of California, was that there was a lot of randomness in the travel time. So they never knew if they were going to really make the deadlines. So the people using the code would, and then this MRMS system would play around with it. It was smart, right? So they'd play around and they'd say, okay, I don't really know my travel time, so let me make the time windows really narrow. So I'm forcing myself to try to make it with a little buffer in there because I made them so narrow. If I miss them, I won't miss the real deadline. And that's very costly. So we wanted to really look at what is the role of uncertainty and how do we deal with the uncertainty. And so just a couple things here. You see that the service quality improves, but at a large cost when we do this with the time windows. And these 30-minute time windows were violated in practice even when 10-minute time windows were used in the planning. So it didn't matter, you still had violations. This upper right corner, you see 35% of the customers were picked up late in 100 of 1,000 runs. So we just simulated it over and over, and we wanted to see, look, what does it mean for the average customer? So this is a pretty big problem. So we had this idea that since the company we were working with was also Regency Taxi, which you might also see when you come to DC, we could use taxi as recourse. So what is that? That means okay, I'm moving along with my paratransit vehicle, and now I think I'm not going to make it. I'm not sure. I want to call a taxi to get that person instead, so I won't miss the deadline. I won't get charged, and I'll have good performance. So if the taxi arrives late, however, you'll pay both the taxi fare and the penalty. So if you do it too late and you call a taxi, they're more likely to not make it, and you pay everything. You do it too early, well, you probably could have made it. Oops, maybe I should have held out. So the first thing we did was tested a couple of threshold policies, and we noticed that as we get closer, more certain if we will be late, but the greater chance the taxi would also be late. And so we don't want to be wasteful, and and so on. So we didn't know what to do, and we found one of the policies worked particularly well. But we actually turned this into a very sophisticated optimization approach. We called it the taxi as recourse problem, and here we modeled this problem using concepts from the stock markets, which is called the optimal stopping problem. And at the time, when I learned about this optimal stopping problem, I said, oh my God, everything in my life is an optimal stopping problem. Okay, so I heard things like, when do I replace my hip? When do you get divorced? If you're dating online, when do you say this is the right one and not date anymore? Okay, it's everything is like this. When do you retire? So we have the same thing here. Okay, so calling a taxi is an irreversible decision, but I can continue with the vehicle, and it has hidden opportunities for later recourse, right? So what recourse means, once I learn the randomness, I can take action and try to fix things. So if I have this hidden opportunity, the longer I wait, the more I learn about how late I might be, the less my randomness is. I learn something, so I want to keep going if I can, but I also don't want to mess up, right? So we conceptualized it this way. It's a very difficult mathematical problem, probably one of the hardest things I've ever been involved with because my student was absolutely brilliant, Nisha Vodopedic. And so what we did was we proved a few things. We proved that that there is a stopping set, that once you enter that stopping set, then you make that decision to sell. Like, that's the time you call for the taxi. Or if it was stock market, you would be selling, right? So we also were able to prove that there's a boundary, and it's not like you see on the left side where there's a lot of stopping regions. It's actually, it looks more like this. And so that's a very nice feature because you don't want to have to come in and come out of it. We also tested the myopic decision rule, which is just as complicated in terms of, I'm still considering uncertainty, but I'm not going to account for the hidden benefit of waiting mathematically. And so I'm counting for what I know right now, but I'm not accounting for every little moment in time into the future, everything I might possibly learn. And we then showed that that boundary lies above the other one, so that you always do better to learn, and you can see how much you learn. Developed a numerical approach based on binomial lattice method, and we applied that, and I won't go any further to that. So I mentioned that we diverted away from the dynamic problem for paratransit and moved ourselves into the airport shuttle world. And so when this project started and they were going to have to put their vehicles into motion, they said, what do we do? What do we do? And they had these three ideas. They said, okay, what if we only have the outbound people, like people you get into the airport and you're going home or to something, you're coming to give a talk here, right? So outbound people and inbound trips are handled separately. That was one thing they wanted to try. What if we had inbound people coming in after the outbound trips? That was another thing they wanted to try. We said, well, why not just do them together, and the optimization will tell you what's the best. Because if it's best to do one after the other, the optimization will find that. So we looked at all three, and you can see the savings that you get. Don't worry about so much what the money means, but you can reduce it to 17 vehicles from 21 by letting it do them mixed together. And that was kind of interesting. But basically, we gave them a variant of that jaw heuristic. So very simple heuristic, does really, really well. Also, the other thing we did was we did an exact solution technique here. And I think this is really interesting to think about. So we're solving the exact problem, and the company said, wait, stop, don't tell us what the exact solution is. We don't want to know. I said, what? In academia, that's like the holy grail, and you're telling me you don't even want us to look at it. They were selling some of the products that were, if you think back to the paratransit one where they're running it in Arizona or wherever, they're selling it. They don't want to know how far off it is. What they do know is it's better than they were getting from doing it by hand. It made sense, the answers. We had to do tweaks to things as they tried new markets, but they didn't want to know the actual best thing they could do, or even how far they were, because they didn't want their clients to know that there was anything else that could be better. Anyway, it was really interesting. We have a paper, so their clients won't ever read it. Because we were working in that area, and I do a lot of disaster work, started thinking about the mobility impaired and using these paratransit vehicles for evacuation. There were some very difficult cases where the mobility impaired people were left behind, and most cities don't have a plan for them. And we said, the paratransit drivers know their clients really well. They know which ones have wheelchairs, they know who needs a second helper with them, they know exactly what capacity they need. And they know them, right? So they can actually help them directly. So we said, well, why not use them to help evacuate them to shelters? And let's pick certain shelters. You're not going to have every shelter available for mobility impaired. Let's have certain shelters that would be devised to support them. And so we developed a technique that couples these things and put that out there. This is an example showing the results for New York City. What can I share with you? We chose 29 shelters out of 238 that were possible. And probably there's a much bigger problem here. We were using publicly available data about all the paratransit vehicles. So this is what we had for our example. Let me see what time it is. Okay. So something we're doing right now is working in microtransit. So microtransit, you can think of as it's a public transit, and it is more flexible than a regular transit vehicle. So for many, many decades, we've been talking about the use of fixed, route transit and all the difficulties we have with it in places other than New York City, basically, or maybe, maybe downtown Seattle, but it has to have a lot of density to do well. So we've always wanted them to be flexible. And finally now we can have that because people carry their phones with them. Something like 85% of Americans have a phone. And so we now have the opportunity to do some of the things we've always been hoping for. And microtransit is thus an approach that we can use to public transit where we make it a little more flexible, kind of like a dial-a-ride or something like the airport shuttle. It's shared rides. It's a bus, but it has flexibility. And the one thing that they do, though, is they have zones. So they have different zones that they operate in. They don't generally operate over the entire city and let it be totally open and flexible. So we wanted to look at developing equitable zone designs, because this is a very important element of making sure that everyone in the community has access to jobs and shopping and food and all the basic things that they might need. And we wanted to make sure that those who were in most need were actually being served. My student did a survey. She actually works on this in business, and she did a survey of the different programs around the country and asked them questions like, what's the most important thing for your design? And equity was one of those things. They wanted to serve the disadvantaged. So we've been looking at this, just wrap this up. It's about to go out for publication, hopefully. And so we were focusing on different kinds of equity. What do we mean by equity? And so we look at both vertical and horizontal equity. So vertical equity is the idea of more demographic kinds of things, where horizontal equity is more over the space, and it's more proximity related. And we applied this for Washington, D.C., and you can see here, if you look at the population, we have one way of viewing how these are block groups, so how the block groups are under each of these metrics. And these were the answers that we got using a taboo search-based approach. So here, if we look at population only, we get one design. If we look at the horizontal equity alone, which is like one of the things people do, then we get the right-sided, a very slightly different design. If we look at vertical equity, we get a totally different coverage. We get totally different zones. We put them together and we get this, and then we can see which one's covering the more disadvantaged people. And you'll see when we combine them, we get more of the BIPOC, which is a certain population, and low income, and 65 plus people, which is really a main target for these systems. So we're advocating for that at this point in this paper. Next thing I'd like to talk about, I'm going to change course, is parking. So first thing that we started thinking about was, in the parking arena, was the idea that in an event, you might want to lease out your parking space in front of your house. So you can imagine, I live in Washington, D.C. A couple of things made me think about this. One was, I had gone to a Nationals game, so at the Nats game, the person I went with knew this woman who was like the gatekeeper of people's spaces behind their building right next to the stadium. And he knew her, so he knew $20. You give it to her, she knows you're coming, you have to make a reservation with her, and she brokers them out for everybody in the neighborhood. So very interesting. It was an interesting experience. It was 1 block away. It was pretty awesome. So really like that. So I was thinking, well, how do we do that? So we have an event in Washington, D.C., like the Women's March that was so large, people need a place to park and get to the metro. I could sell my parking space in front of my house. I could sell my driveway. How do people get into the market? How do they become part of it? You can also think in very dense areas where parking is extremely expensive. So I grew up in New York, and I think, wow, I can remember 20 years ago it was $100 a day to park in New York City. If I live there and I have a space, I can rent that space out while I go to work somewhere else, right? So why not allow that to happen? So I wanted to know, can we support that market? How do we bring that market together? So here we developed a time-differentiated pricing approach for a competitive mixed traditional and crowdsourced event parking market. So I'm talking crowdsourced is like us trying to rent out our spaces, and then the traditional is like the parking garages that are putting their prices out. We have things like Spot Hero, Parkwiz, and all these other apps that you can use to broker this. And so our goal was to find an optimum Equilibrium time differentiating parking price for event parking. So if I want to enter the market, how do I know how to price it? We model this as a stochastic equilibrium problem with equilibrium constraints. We have at the upper level competing parking owners. We can group the people who are trying to get their spots off, or we can do them individually, it doesn't really matter, but you can make the problem a little smaller if you group people together. And you can compete with the big parking lots this way. At the lower level, we have the demand. That's the people who are trying to figure out where to park and are deciding even if they want to drive. So it's elastic demand, they may not want to go in. So I have this problem. I have the individual parking owner gets their own problem. Each one of them, they're in this competition, but they have the same market. The market is a lower level problem. So I have a stochastic equilibrium problem with equilibrium constraints, very hard to solve. We use a diagonalization approach. Each stochastic mathematical problem with equilibrium constraints representing the problem for each parking owner or the parking lot owner is solved using a sample averaging approach and a gradient descent. The lower level problems were decomposed by scenario and solved in parallel. And anyway, we were able to solve it. So what did we do? We found that adding private parking of about 7% of the market was what we tried out in an example case. We found for this case that the average price dropped 15%, but the users served increased total by 7%. So you got more people coming into the market, and everyone's paying just a little less. The revenue of the public locations decreased a little bit, but the individuals got a little bit of money. Yeah. Using EV here, EV is not an EV vehicle, but using expected value, that is ignoring uncertainty, reduced the revenue for everybody, and in particular for the public, it reduced it to almost 23%, and for the private ones, reduced, oh wait, what did I get? I got it backwards. No, got it the other way. 9% for the public and 23% for the private. The revenue went down because of not accounting for uncertainty. The total revenue of the parking market went up 10%. Consumer surplus was found to go down quite a bit if we didn't account for any competition, and we tried to solve the whole problem for the good of the whole, like a system-based approach, and said, let's just see how we can do otherwise and how much gain do we get from the competition. And social welfare goes up when more crowd space parking spaces are given. We are also looking at dynamic pricing for parking. We just recently completed this work, where we're saying you have a different parking lot owners out there, and rather than try to model this mathematically, we're using a machine learning based approach. That is, machine learning allows you to not have a model, it's model free. So you're just basing it all on data. So you're getting feedback from the prices from these different apps, and you're making decisions based on what you know about who actually filled your space and actually made their reservation and came. And so with this kind of feedback mechanisms, we use this multi-agent deep Q learning approach. Not sure what I want to say about this other than, again, we found that there was some advantage to having some competition, but not entirely competitive approach. And we found that applying the multi-agent DRL, deep reinforcement learning approach, significantly increased the average cumulative reward compared to other policies that were very reasonable. So it did quite well. The last thing I want to talk about are delivery problems. So we're in the middle of COVID, and I hadn't really used much of online delivery, as I was always just go to the store. My sons, who at the time, one was off in college and one was home in the latter years of high school, they were buying a ton online. And my son that was home, was basically in the basement for, the year and a half of deep COVID, and he was getting all these packages. And so I see these packages coming in, and I'm like, what in the world is he buying? And then I thought, am I going to be one of those moms who doesn't know, like my son is doing something really bad, because, what's going on here? So I went down to the basement. I said, okay, I want you to open those boxes. Tell me what's in it. So he opened all the boxes for me. And one of the boxes just had chapstick in it. One box had deodorants in it. I don't remember the other box, but it was like stuff you could go around the corner and walk to at CVS and go buy them. And I was like, what is going on here? And so I was really thinking about, like, why is this so big for this generation, right? They're very comfortable with this, and why am I not comfortable with it? And I started thinking, okay, there's times I would really like this. Like when my son has not done his homework assignment, he has a book, big book report or whatever that's due the next day and hasn't bought the book yet. we need it now, right? So, oh my God, it's like 10 in the morning, we need to get this by, no later than noon. There's no way I can get to a store and back. I'm in the middle of working, whatever. So, wish I could order that and have it delivered. I pay a lot. Or I'm going to have people over to my house, and I'm going to, I'm in the middle of cooking. There's no way I can go to the store. I really need a grater. My grater broke. I wish somebody would deliver that to me, but if you don't deliver it to me today, it's not going to be useful to me tomorrow. So I started thinking about the same day delivery type of problem. So that's the second thing. So the first thing I'm going to share with you is this meal delivery, which I've never seen so many meals delivered to my house. I never imagined that that would be something that would become a norm. So I'm going to talk about meal delivery first and then same day delivery after that. So online delivery has grown ridiculously, right? Way more than they anticipated pre-COVID, right? So in, I don't know what year that was, they would, at Morgan Stanley, they estimated that by 2023, that the online delivery market would be 13% of the market. But it's turned out that we've really surpassed that. By July 2022, it was 22%. So even our projections that were probably considered crazy back then are well exceeded. And also with meal delivery. Meal delivery is a big business. So we started working with Grubhub, and they shared some data with us, and we've done a lot of studies with, related to this, some of them in conjunction with them, some of them on our own. Sometimes we do things that they would never do, so I don't want to put them in the spotlight here to say that they like everything that we've done. Some of the things I think have been helpful, and some of the things are just because we're curious. So we have at-will drivers. This is just crowdsourced drivers. And they can check in and check out to the system. Typically, they'll check in, check out for about 2 hours. And we can sign them with a single job or a bundled job. We give them 2 things to do. And they have the right to reject orders. We were just talking about this earlier, that Uber is the same kind of problem, that the drivers can reject, looking for better things. So how do we assign the orders to the drivers so that we can minimize the costs, maximize freshness? So order ready time is really, really important. So you imagine you order something, you don't want it to come cold, and minimize click to door times. That's the time it takes from when you click and say, I want to buy it, until it arrives to me. I've studied a number of different things. These are 5 different things. We're actually looking at about 6 different things right now. Some are done, some are in the middle, some are coming. But these are the things we've been looking at. I'm just going to share a little bit with you about each of these. And I realize I don't want to talk too much longer because I see the time. So I'll spend a little bit of time on each, but maybe skip over some things. So when we started working with them, this was early in COVID. And the whole world was scared. We didn't have vaccines, and people were ordering their food. And I was thinking about that there's a lot of crowding at these restaurants by the drivers who are sacrificing themselves. And how do we keep them safe? How do we make sure that we don't have a big crowd at the restaurants trying to help everybody else from getting COVID, right? And there's also the issue that when they crowd at the restaurants to try to pick up the things they're picking up, which may or may not be ready, they're taking up space in, sometimes on the street, blocking traffic, and it's really an issue for many locations. So we looked at this idea of social distancing, had this idea that there are these spaces basically, or slots, and you're trying to get, almost reserve your slot when you get these orders. And then there's some possible slack you might want to put into that, because you might have to wait there a little bit. And so on. So we had actions that would be to postpone an order so that we could try to bundle them together, adding Slack and order assignment. How do we assign them to the drivers? And there's a lot of rules in the assignment. For example, if somebody's been in the system a long time and hasn't gotten a job, you might want to give them a job even if they're not the most ideal one, because you want to keep them coming back as to serve the company, and so on. So we started with a simulation optimization for this. We had data from Grubhub from late 2019. We didn't want to get the COVID data. We wanted pre-COVID data. Average customers in this location for the day was 1,282, and average number of restaurants, 463. So it was a typical city on a typical Friday. They wouldn't share what city it was. We were kind of mapping it. We think it might be Iowa. I have no idea. So we developed a simulation that basically creates synthetic data based on the real distribution functions from their data. And We did an optimization for the order assignment that's embedded within the simulation. And we found a number of things, like in this top left, you see that we can look at ordinary demand, and then we doubled the demand, and you can see the violations that occurred, that you had too much crowding there. You see, go way up. And things like this. We looked at how much slack time, so the more slack time you built in affected the number of violations you have, and things like that. In other work, we started thinking about the courier's perspective. So you're the driver. What should you do? So should you drive around aimlessly? Should you stay at or near the last delivery location? Should you hover near the restaurant? Should you position between shopping centers? This kind of thing. And we wanted to know the optimal action that the driver should take. And we used simulation optimization as well as deep reinforcement learning to do this. So why do you need the simulation? Almost every time you see anything about machine learning, you will have a simulator. And that's because we don't usually have reality. We have to make up a reality. So a simulator is our basic reality. These machine learning techniques are model-free, which means they're relying entirely on your data. So the data comes from the environment, so we make the simulation the environment. That's the data for pickup and drop-off, so you can see the differences between them. And so we modeled this problem, this Markov decision problem that underlies this deep reinforcement learning approach. In these techniques, you have a state vector, that's our location and order information if an order is offered to a driver. Then we have the action. The action is the job, should I take the job or not? Do I accept or reject it? If there's no job offer, then do I move? What direction do I move? Or do I stay put? And the goal was to find the optimal policy of those kinds of decisions. You get the new state from the meal delivery simulation optimization approach, and then we have our methods. We've tried two different methods, a DQN, DQ network approach, and actor-critic. Actor-critic means you have your neural networks and you split them so that you have one that's giving you actions and one that's giving you the value of your action. So it just splits these two. And we're still working out to see if one is necessarily better than the other. We're finding the actor-critic is probably better. You can see our different policies. This is from the DQN approach, so you can see if there's a lot of orders in the system or not a lot of orders in the system, what does best. We looked at different kinds of policies that an ordinary person might think of doing, compared it to our DQN approach with and without accept and reject. And you see what does best in the bold there. So it's not always better. The tips had a major effect on acceptance and on the best thing to do as well. We also asked, is it very risky to have an at-will workforce, right? So normally, in the past, we had a workforce that you paid all day to be there, and you would have them work for you. And you control them. You tell them to do something, and they do it. Now you go with an at-will workforce, so we can think any of us in the room can do this, and we could say no. We say, nah, I don't think that's really good, or I don't like the profit on that one. We can see the tips in advance, and I don't like it. Not good enough for me to bother. I don't want to waste my car on this, or my fuel on this. So there are efficiency gains to be had by using the at-will workforce, because you don't have this group of people that you're paying no matter what. But you lose control of the availability, location, and willingness of the drivers. So we wanted to compare these two. We developed a tabby search heuristic with embedded ejection chain method for looking at this in a rolling horizon framework, and we compared these two strategies for your workforce. Notice here, it's a highly stochastic or uncertain setting. There's uncertainty in order placement, order preparation time, pickup and drop-off service times, travel times. But when we have this at-will workforce, we introduce even more uncertainty. So the couriers sign in and sign out, and you don't control when. Couriers sign in at random locations and things like this. So it's even more uncertainty in it. So we developed this technique that I just mentioned. I'm going to skip through this. This is the tabby search with the ejection chain method to find the best paths for each. And just noting here that we had a 22% reduction in the resource utilization with the at-will workforce, and the at-will workforce doubled the risk of failing to meet very large click-to-door time targets. Very small numbers missed it at that level, but it got worse for like you were more likely to have really bad cases if you had an at-will workforce. A couple little other things I just want to mention. We had order assignment through dynamic surge pricing. That is what we're doing now. The idea that we can think of and try to determine what the best surge prices are to pay somebody to get them to take the jobs during the most busy periods. So that's when they might be working for other companies, and we want to entice them to come and work for us at that moment when we need them most. And that's a work in progress. Again, we're using machine learning for this. And the green yield delivery operations, okay, so we know that these things are not great for the environment. It is much better when people like my son would walk to CVS instead of having them all ordered and coming one box at a time to my house. That makes no sense, right? It's very bad for the environment. So we wanted to know, could we impose some kind of emission reduction target and have some way of having this system still work? So what if we used bicycles? And these are special bicycles for cargo transport. And we found that if we had the bicycles make a 1 to 1.5 mile range, depending on what we're talking about, pickup or drop off, for a 30% emissions reduction target, 30% bike penetration produced and added 6.65 minutes for the click-to-door time. So it's already going down. And at 50% reduction, we could not serve the market. So it wasn't possible because we had not enough vehicles to make the longer distance drives. So there's a bunch more things that I'm not showing you here, but it's kind of interesting to think, how can we incorporate more green solutions to green the whole environment and still be able to have the business function. So I mentioned earlier this same-day delivery problem with time guarantee, that I want my can opener right away. I don't want to wait until tomorrow. By tomorrow, my event is over and I don't want the can opener anymore. So in this case, we developed a multi-stage stochastic mixed-integer program in a rolling horizon framework with a shrinking horizon, because as the day's ending, the whole thing is shrinking in terms of the amount of time that's left. And we developed a parallelized progressive hedging approach for this problem. We considered customer satisfaction. The sooner I get it, the happier I am. At some point, I'm not happy at all anymore, and I don't even want it anymore. So how do I serve this? The longer I wait, remember that waiting problem gives me more information about what other orders might be made and which orders actually come in. So it's a really big problem that, all of us go online and we put things in the shopping cart and then we never hit the button to buy. So the goal is to try to get people to actually hit that button to buy. And so how do you do that? You give them time guarantees with certain, when they make that decision about what to order. And you might get them to actually buy. So the decision variable here is, what is the time guarantee to give? And you're trying to look at your operations and know that you're going to be able to serve this, and you're better off if you can bundle things together, so waiting a little bit will actually help you. So here we applied this in an example we made for Arlington, Virginia. It's in Northern Virginia inside the Beltway. And we had, ultimately the customers were more satisfied with a 2-hour policy, but the number of vehicles went up 68% in what was needed, or 22% if you had a 3-hour fixed policy. So it did quite well in general in terms of that balance between the cost of operating and satisfying your customers. We can adjust certain factors. We really want to get people to come back, and we want to think about long-term market gain. So we can emphasize increasing immediate cash flow or long-term sales volume to align with our changing business needs based on some of the parameters in the model that we can change around. So I come to my basic conclusion here. What was being shared in all these things? I started thinking, okay, so why are these part of the sharing economy? Is it sharing or is it economic exchange, like the Harvard Business Review is claiming? So here in the vehicle sharing, I have bicycles and cars, so we're sharing stuff. If I go back to my staff stuff in space. In ride sharing, we have the paratransit vehicles, the airport shuttles, the microtransit buses. We're sharing stuff again. In parking, we're sharing space. So we have limited space, and everybody wants a piece of it. And the delivery, I think mostly we're sharing staff. You can also think about stuff, but mostly we're sharing staff, and this is called crowd sharing logistics. And so I don't know if it's an economic, I think it's probably true, it's an economic exchange. We are doing some level of sharing, but we're not really sharing for the good of sharing. It's not just giving it away. So, and ultimately what I've shared with you is the idea of using optimization to support these things. like exact techniques and heuristic techniques, both of which work extremely well for these applications. In simulation, we used agent-based models and stochastic discrete event simulation. Both came in handy. Simulation optimization, we merged a little bit of both. And then we also used the machine learning where we could use model-free approaches and learn the distributions from the environments. Had a lot of papers. Some are published, some are under review now, a couple are in the works. I never give a talk anymore without giving a shout out for my journal that Dr. Chen luckily mentioned to you. So this is with Elsevier. It's called Sustainability Analytics and Modeling. It's using mathematics, basically OR computer science, to tackle the world's challenges, so big global challenges. The environment being one of them, but many others as well. And so I just let you know of existence, and you consider it an outlet for you. So I mentioned earlier, I keep saying the word we. There's a lot of we's here, so a lot of people have contributed to this in a variety of different ways. Some are one is at Grubhub, one is now US DOT, head of research, was not at the time though. We've had head of companies and people who are now faculty, people who are now working at big companies, other faculty, so a lot of people are involved or were involved. Thank you very much for having me here. And,
we have some time for questions. Anybody?
Anybody ever drive one of those vehicles? I work as a...
Jeff, I know.
Yeah.
For the
Speak
paratransit,
louder.
Okay, I can repeat it.
the paratransit example,
Yeah.
one of the measures to use the taxi force.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if the people are mobility impaired, the taxi.
Yeah. So the question was a real world problem about the paratransit example with using taxi as recourse. Could you really use a taxi as recourse? I would say this company probably could. They have some specialized vehicles that for individuals, but not every company could do that, right? So this is a really important challenge to know your clients and what their needs are. So an ordinary taxi wouldn't probably make it for a lot of them. Some of them it would be fine. So it depends. Another big thing that came up with the mobility challenge folks is that they often come with other people, so you have to think about the capacity they need individually. So it's not just one seat in the vehicle sometimes, and you don't know, there's a little randomness in that. Yeah, thank you for the question. Did you have a question?
Oh, yeah, I was just, so it's harder to remove the mobility policy.
Okay.
So you mentioned this long-term happiness of drivers. Sometimes this kind of seems hard to measure, like how in comparison to the rap,
Okay.
like what kind of institutions change the last time? Because it takes some time to understand whether drivers should.
Yeah. So the question, I'm not sure I got exactly what the question is, but the topic is the drivers in meal delivery, and I mentioned that we care about keeping them happy because we want them to keep working for us, and we want them to not feel dismayed and give up and leave the system and maybe never come back, right? So the question is,
It's more like how to model that.
how do we model that? Yeah, we didn't attempt to model happiness. That would be a little tricky here. But what we did is just built into our simulators strategies for keeping them happy that were based on what Grubhub had told us to do. They said, like, if it's been, I don't know, more than 10 minutes and they haven't got, whatever that protocol was, and we built that in just based on their experience. So we didn't attempt that. One thing they brought up to us that we started working on, and I'm not sure if we'll continue working on it, is a question of trust, which I thought was kind of related to this happiness, but not trust between the company and the drivers, trust between the drivers and the restaurants. So drivers get to the restaurant, the meal's not ready. So they're like, next time they go, they won't rush. Well, why do they want to sit there and wait, right? They can take another job and then go there. Or maybe they don't want to take that job because they know that restaurant's involved or something like that. The restaurant knows that driver always comes late because the driver says coming late, and they're like, oh, it's been assigned to that driver. I'm not going to worry about it. I'll make that one later. And so if you don't have trust between them, it could spiral a little bit. So there's all kinds of human elements. We were talking about this before now because and you worked with Uber and some other companies like this, and so the same kind of problems happen, right? There's humans involved, and they're autonomous, different from being a human worker that's full-time employed. They're autonomous, and so we have to think about our business and also think about how do we keep them serving our business, which is a really different model than anything we've done in past operations that we can probably think of. There's a lot of interesting questions there. Yeah.
I have a question on your first parking project. I think I saw it was like 7+% of added users.
I'm sorry, which problems?
The first of the two parking projects.
Okay, yeah. So people that come, we had 7%, we said, in our example, something like 130 people come in with a spot out of, I don't remember, it was over 1,000 regular spots from the big parking garages.
Right, I was concerned if you looked at all at how this would affect congestion by adding more parking in urban areas.
We did not look at that at all. So I know that we have an expert in that area here with us, Dr. Boyle's here from UT Austin, who's working and has done quite a bit of work on the congestion issue with parking. I would say that these systems can help in general with that, and in fact, knowing where your spot is and getting to spots that maybe are less crowded. We did include in our model crowdedness at the spots so that if you were stuck at a large facility, there was a crowdedness factor added because you might have to wait online and it might be very crowded to get to the spot. So we do have that in our model, but that's about the only thing we have in there, not crowdedness on the streets. Yeah, I would think these systems would help that in an event in particular, and in anything that uses these reservation systems would be very helpful because people won't be roaming around. I like the time differentiation part, which I didn't really talk about. Just the idea that as you get later, and either you have a lot of space and maybe you'll make it cheaper for people, or maybe it's later and there's not a lot of demand left and we're going to sell at a really high price and try to milk everybody for the last few spots, which would probably come from behaviors that you would see and then try to learn what to do, right? But we didn't account for those behaviors. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Does your models focus on the transit station and how we would have parking instead of transit? And at least specifically like the first slides, talking about like this mile and lots of connections in DC, like is it similar like how like the shuttle lights and the silver line, how airport transit is changed, how parking will be changed, how paratransit is changing, concept of transit.
So the question is really about the expansion of public transportation systems and how we could model their impact, maybe? Yeah. Is that a good way to say it? So definitely none of these are addressing that particular aspect. But these are the types of techniques you could consider. I would say long-term question, more of a mathematical modeling question, not so much data-driven. The data-driven approaches, you need a lot of data over a long period. I don't know that you could get that. So the machine learning might not work for you. But I would think the optimization-based approaches, there's no reason you couldn't look at that. You do need data, though, to understand impacts. But what we do with these kinds of techniques is we'll model the current situation. In many of my works, we'll model the current situation and try to show that we can match it. So I have a maritime example where we're looking at global trade flows around the world, and I have a big Arctic project. So we're looking at, well, what does it mean when the Arctic thaws and more traffic goes through the Arctic? How much flow do we think will shift to there? So to be able to develop a model for that and to have anyone believe our results, we have to replicate first what's happening in reality. So that's the approach we've taken. We replicated today's conditions, showed that we get a very good match with the real port throughputs. And then we expand this to include the Arctic, and we're making projections with the models. So you would do something like that, I think, with what you're describing. Instead of doing a retrospective, kind of looking back, which you could do, but then you would just use data, I think, if you were looking back historically. But if you wanted to see, I propose to do this, what do we think the impact's going to be, that's one way that we can try to do that. Yeah, you'll notice that I'm a supply side person, I'm not demand side. So I never try to project demand, other than this bottom level tries to tell you what the market will do. But that's the most I get into demand. I'm really all supply side. Like how do we design the things we're going to offer? Any other questions?
Other questions? Mark, do you want to have the final word to point to maybe Brenda?
So the cheap answer to that is no. Right?
Oh, okay.
Frankly speaking, the one thing I will say, other than I will show up with some very cheap quiz just so you guys can get points for showing up. The other thing I will say is a lot of this is going to get spread out between the rest of the class. There's so many really cool points in here. One of the big things that isn't here, because optimization is about optimizing.
Yeah.
The best thing she's optimizing is money.
Ah.
We are going to talk about money, but money drives optimization. And the difficult thing in the optimization world is when you're trying to optimize public good, and you have to argue about what public good is. It's like the demand side. It's really hard. And you heard talk a little about equity. And if you define equity this way, you get the green shows up over here, and if you change the definition of equity, you get green over there. And it's not which green is right; it's which definition of equity. So I love that. So I think as much as the modeling is cool, as a generalist in myself, I think the way she set up these programs and understood who the players are and what they're looking at and what they're trading off. I love the urban delivery. You have the restaurants and what they're looking for, and you have the delivery drivers and what they're looking for, and application developers and what they're looking for, and trying to balance those three things out. Mathematically is a really good way to actually look and structure that. But to set that up, you have to understand what's important to all of it.
Yeah.
So those, from a generalist perspective, are wonderful things to take away from this talk. Also, since the vast majority of engineers, and I've been beating on you about it's not math, it's not math.
It is the math. It's always the math.
It's best.
It depends. And you did hear her use that.
So, okay, so thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
So we have refreshments here that Code is helping to set up, and so if you want to linger a bit more,